going to do a longer video today. It is a bit of a complex topic, so forgive me if I meander around a bit, but it's a topic I really wanted to address on here, not because anyone has actually asked me to do a video on this. This is my own idea, but more because I am tired of people asking me this question, and I want to have people be able to come on here and just watch this video so I don't have to explain, the same thing over and over again when I'm interacting with people online, because it's a topic that comes up a lot, and that is the blue zone data. So I'm going to try to delve into this. And then there's a couple of kind of, side topics that I want to clarify that are, related to the blue zone data, but not, directly correlated. So I'm going to get to that at the end. So, first of all, we have the issue of the author of the blue zone data and the book that became extremely popular after the research came out. Now, I do believe that this guy has an agenda. And this is nothing about his personal character. I'm sure he's a lovely person. I have heard him on interviews. He seems very genuinely well-meaning. He has started a lot of initiatives to try to get people in marginalized communities to start eating more whole foods, which is wonderful. Like, I fully support that project. My concern is that he does have a bias towards plant-based diets from his own, personal life, and that really skewed the way that he observed and interpreted the data, when he was doing his research. This was not a case of someone just going out into the world to, find what they find. Like, I really think he knew what he wanted to find, and he made sure that his data followed that, right? So there are a lot of issues with misrepresenting, cherry picking, and then just discrepancies when it comes to looking at his data. So first of all, there are a wide variety of cultures around the world that live a long time in good health, and he cherry picked only a few, right? Now, I mean, maybe the book would have been too long if he had covered every single one. That's fair, right? But he seemed to cherry pick the ones that tended to eat more plants, right? And there are many cultures that eat less plants and more animal foods that did not make it into his data. So I really think what the blue zone data shows more is that traditional diets make you healthier and make you live longer. But he really focused on certain aspects of diet that I don't think are representative of all cultures that live a long time. So, for example, we have a place like Hong Kong. Now, some people have argued that this is a place with a lot of affluence, and so that's really the correlation here. And that may be true, for sure. But people in Hong Kong eat a lot of beef. It's like the highest beef intake annually in the entire world, and they have some of the longest average lifespans, right? So clearly, the meat isn't detracting from their lifespan. There's also places like Switzerland and Iceland. These in traditional people who are still living more traditionally in these places. They're eating a lot of sheep. They're eating a lot of dairy. And for at least a good chunk of the year, right, it's too cold to grow anything. So maybe they have some things preserved, right? But, it's a fairly low plant diet a good chunk of the year just because of, the reality of how things grow seasonally in those kinds of regions. So those cultures were also left out of his data. And then we have the really interesting the Mormons are another really interesting piece of data because he chose to include only Seventh-day Adventists in his research, whereas Mormons actually have a very similar average lifespan to Seventh-day Adventists. And they lead a similar lifestyle in a lot of ways, right? These close-knit communities and stuff like that. But Mormons eat a lot more beef and pork than Seventh-day Adventists, who tend to eat more like pescatarian or vegetarian. So, again, clearly the meat is not the thing, right? Because all other things being, pretty similar, the meat is not detracting from the lifespan there, but he left that out, right? The other issue is just how he conducted his research. So he visited these cultures in spring and summer. Now, if you know anything about ancestral diets, you know that they are seasonal, right? And so spring and summer are the growing seasons. And the growing seasons mean more plant foods to eat, right? So it's problematic to visit a culture in one season and say this is how they eat all year round, because that's just not true. When you don't have access to these major supermarkets, that is just not the way people eat. And so all the data is going to be skewed towards how people eat during the growing season, not during the winter season. He also went to some places during Lent, which, people who know about that practice know that a lot of people fast, a lot of people give up meat, and there are potentially some great, actually, health benefits to doing religious fasting. So, this may be a part of some of this blue zone data is people are doing this, ritual type of fasting on a regular basis. But again, you can't take what is like basically a fast, like a deprivation diet for a culture, and then say, oh, that's how they're eating all year, right? Because it's not. He also did not account for translation issues. So there's a really big issue with the way red meat is translated cross-culturally. In a lot of languages, red meat tends to be translated as beef, where red meat to us can, mean a variety of ruminant animals. So a lot of the cultures in the blue zone data are people that live in rocky, hilly, mountainous environments, right? So there's some interesting correlations there too, which I find really fascinating. Like, people walking up and down hills and mountains all day tend to be healthier, right? People living in those kinds of environments also tend to not have cows, because cows tend to do better in, like, big plains, like high plains or meadows or things like that. These very rocky up and down environments, usually animals like sheep and goats do better. So if he's asking people in these environments, do you eat red meat? They're going to say no, because they don't eat beef, right? But they're eating lamb and goat every day. And he didn't account for that, again. He also didn't ask anyone about dairy, which is really interesting because a lot of the cultures he studied, especially like the Greeks, they eat a lot of dairy. They're eating a lot of cheese, they're eating a lot of yogurt, right, cream, things like that. That didn't make it into his diet at all, even though that's a good chunk of the diet in many of these people he studied. And then there's just some interesting discrepancies in terms of, like, his observations versus how he interpreted them, right? Like, he would say, oh, this family only ate one pig the whole year, but then he would describe the fact that, like, they had a whole herd of pigs on their farm, which doesn't really add up. Usually if a society is like, one pig is lasting the whole year, it's because they are in a lot of poverty, and that one pig costs a lot of money, and, they only have the one, or maybe two, and they're really making it stretch. But if a culture, there tends to be a correlation that, like, if a culture has access to meat, they will eat it, so some of this, these cultures that are described as not eating much meat, it's kind of out of necessity, not out of choice. So if a culture has a whole herd of pigs available to them, they're probably eating more than one a year. So some of this stuff just doesn't add up. He also did things like, for example, the Costa Rica diet. Anyone who goes to Costa Rica will tell you, like, they're eating beans, rice, and animal protein. That's a huge part of the diet. But he only talked about the beans and rice, right? I don't know why he would leave out a major part of the diet when it's very easily observable for anyone who goes there. Same with Okinawans, actually. Again, people who go there will talk about, wow, they eat a lot of pork and they eat a lot of seafood, right? In addition to the rice and the fermented soy and the vegetables and the yams and the seaweed and all this kind of stuff. So that's probably a very important part of the diet too. But he really highlighted those things and really left out especially the pork part, which is actually a huge part of the Okinawan diet. So again, a lot of issues, a lot of discrepancies. Um, so we really have to look at the blue zone data as information. It's interesting information. There's a lot of stuff in it, especially about like community and the way people engage in exercise and movement and the way people support each other. Like, that's the stuff that I actually find most fascinating about the blue zone data, is more like the other lifestyle factors that seem to be correlated. The nutrition stuff is interesting, for sure, and I always take things into account, but as I've described in this video so far, there are a lot of issues with cherry picking, of misrepresenting, and just having skewed observations based on the time of year he was there. So all things to keep in mind, it's not the be-all, end-all of research on traditional diets. There's a lot of information out there, and I encourage you to explore and delve more into that. But there are two other related topics that I do want to get into. The first is just the problem with epidemiological type nutrition studies in the first place. Epidemiology means that they are giving people basically surveys, right? And they have them put things like, how many times a week did you eat eggs for the last year? Or how many times did you go on a walk, over 2 miles in the last year? So there's a lot of issue with, like, do people even remember that stuff accurately? Really? So there's no guarantee that that kind of data is very accurate. And then there's the issue with the fact that correlation is not causation, right? So correlation is fascinating. I'm all about it, but we can't just say, like, oh, like, then this is the answer. There has to be a lot more things that fall into place before we can really be sure about something. So, for example, say you have someone that, middle class, lives in an area with a low amount of environmental toxicity, tends to be pretty active, right? Like, rides their bike all the time, goes on hikes, has a stable job, they're married, in a good relationship, and they also eat a lot of whole grains, a lot of plant foods, and not very much meat. So that person is probably going to be very healthy, right? That person is probably going to have really good lab work, and maybe very few or no diagnosis of chronic disease issues, right? So someone could look at that and say, oh my gosh, they're eating all these plants and whole grains. That must mean that that is what is making them healthy, right? Maybe it is. Maybe it's the fact that they live in a place with low toxicity. Maybe it's the fact that they're super active. Maybe it's the fact that they have a stable job. There are so many factors that go into our health, and epidemiological studies have a really hard time controlling for all these variables. And culturally, people who are into living a healthy lifestyle tend to be the ones that are kind of buying into this idea that you need to eat less meat to be healthy. So it's really hard to tease these things apart, and, frankly, a lot of studies, again, epidemiological studies on the dangers of saturated fat, this is a similar issue, right? Because the people who are eating, big steaks and ribs and bacon and this, all these stuff that's high in saturated fat, they tend to be living in places with higher environmental toxicity, right? Like lower socioeconomic status. They tend to be eating a lot more processed foods, right? All this kind of stuff. And again, these studies aren't really teasing apart all these other factors. Once in a while, you will find a study that says, like, we corrected for all these other variables and we still found this correlation. So that's better. But a lot of them aren't, and so it's very, very hard to understand this. You really have to look at a lot of layers of data. And epidemiology, again, it's interesting, right? It gives info, but it's not the be-all, end-all of research. So I just wanted to bring that up because I think that's super important and relevant to analyzing the blue zone data as well. The second piece that I wanted to follow up with, towards the end here is the fact that quality of life and longevity are actually two different things. So I believe we can have both. I believe we can have high quality of life and live a long time. And I think there are, again, cultures out there that show this, right? That have this. But even if we were to assume that eating more animal products lowered your lifespan, which again, I'm not convinced is true, but even if we assume that it is, there is some interesting research showing that eating a high protein diet earlier in life is correlated with lower longevity, like earlier death. And that low animal protein diets that are also a little bit calorie restricted tend to actually be correlated with longer lifespans. There's a really fascinating book called 100 Million Years of Food that I encourage you to look at. It's written for the layperson, very easy to read. It has a lot of really interesting research about this stuff. So, maybe that's true. I don't know. It could be true. But, again, I don't think we need to be fetishizing longevity as much as a lot of people are, and especially a lot of people that are really into blue zone data. They tend to be really fetishizing this idea of a super long lifespan. And I'm not sure it's really a great idea. And part of that is because if we assume this thing is true, that eating higher amounts of animal protein earlier in life leads to a shorter lifespan, what we also see is that eating a high animal protein diet earlier in life also correlates with better production of sex hormones, better brain function, better production of neurotransmitters, right? All these things that make us feel good and happy and energetic and vital, right? And when people are eating a low protein diet and they're restricting their calories chronically, okay, yeah, they may live longer. It may be true. But they also are probably not producing their sex hormones well, right? We see this, that people, they're not producing neurotransmitters well. Their brain function is not optimal, right? And so again, what is the trade-off here? And I think this is really important when we look at just the patterns and life ways of indigenous cultures as well. People bring up the Inuit to me a lot because there was very early anthropological data. This is before the Inuit adopted more of a Western lifestyle. Now a lot of the data is confounded, unfortunately, because of exposure to Western lifestyle. But early Western contact with the Inuit, it did show that a lot of them were only living into their 60s, right? Even living a fully traditional lifestyle. And yeah, they would tend to die of heart disease in their 60s, was some of the observations from doctors who worked with them early on. But those doctors also said what's amazing is they have no disease up until that point. They are impeccably healthy. There's no cancer, right? There's no mental illness. There's no stomach issues. There's no immune deficiency. There's no health issues. And then they get heart disease and die in their 60s, right? So that's important to think about, right? Is longevity really what we should be after? Or is there more to it than that? So that's just an open question that I'll leave. I will say that sometimes the averages we look at in traditional cultures look low because there is a lot more death, especially early in life, right? And then, through childbirth and accidents, just physical trauma, there tends to be more accidental death in these kinds of cultures because they don't have access to modern medicine, right? So, if you get really hurt, and you have some kind of major physical trauma, you're not going to go to the emergency room and get surgery, you're just going to die. Same thing if you get a really severe infection, right? Antimicrobial herbs are great, but in the case of a serious pathogenic infection, that might not be enough, and so more people do die of acute infections in those kinds of societies. So there is generally lower average lifespan in those societies, but the people who do make it without any of those kinds of accidents or infections or things like that, again, they tend to live a long time and in very good health. Again, we have so much So many observations from anthropologists and doctors who had early contact with these people, or who are still visiting these people, some of which are still living traditionally, and they see elders. Right? When you go and spend time with these populations, you see elders. Now, we don't always know how old these people are. I've seen people guess, like, yeah, I mean, it looks like there were a lot of people in their 70s, 80s, 90s, just kind of like eyeballing it. But a lot of people in these kind of societies, they don't keep time the way we do in the Western world, and so they don't necessarily know what their birthday, right, or things like that. So it's also hard to get data on exactly how many people are living to what age. But we do observe, like, yeah, there are a lot of elders, and they're also very, like, vital and healthy, and, like, they don't have dementia, and they don't have arthritis, and they don't have cancer, and all these kinds of stuff. So again, there is a lot of pros and cons here, and a lot of things to take into consideration, and I just encourage you to maybe rethink why you are so obsessed with this idea of longevity, and if it makes a little more sense to consider ways we can live a reasonably long time, but also have a very high quality of life while we are alive. It's just, a different set of values that, you may consider. But the point is, all this stuff is complex. The Blue Zone data is complex. Studying all the factors that go into health and longevity is very complex. I don't think there are any clear-cut answers. I think you can be healthy, and I think you can live a long time doing a lot of different things, and that's wonderful, and that's beautiful, and that's exciting. So yeah, I hope this was a helpful video to be able to navigate this topic a little more. Thanks, everyone.